War and conflict has reshaped nations and devastated entire generations. And with a duty to protect and provide for their citizens, many nation-states down the ages have fallen short.
One of the features of the nation-state, one of the justifications for the nation-state, was that it was always there to protect its citizens from external invaders, from enemies. But of course, one of the tragic features of the 20th century is that we learned that governments can't be trusted with their own people.
Conflicts dominate history, and yet wars, why they started and how they were fought, are constantly disputed. Wars and myth-building go hand in hand. Even when the winner is clear, what led to victory is not. These are the myths of history's wars and conflicts. On the 7th of December 1941, an event occurred that rocked the lives of all Americans, led to the US's entry into World War II, and inspired a myth that would cast the US president as a traitor and a liar. At 6 a.m., Japanese fighter planes took off from an aircraft carrier in the Pacific Ocean. At 7:55 a.m., they reached Hawaii and bombed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Almost 2,500 Americans were killed. It prompted President Franklin D. Roosevelt to declare that the United States, after keeping out of World War II for over 2 years, was now at war with Japan. December 7th, 1941 is a date, the US president said, which will live in infamy.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
The United States suffered a severe shock when the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor. The public, the government, the military, they were all quite shocked, stunned to a degree of disbelief and angered as well.
The attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise offensive, Roosevelt said, unprovoked and without warning. But was that true? For decades since the attack, a conspiracy theory developed, ebbing and flowing, but never fully disappearing, that the president knew in advance about the Japanese attack and did nothing to prevent it. That Roosevelt knew of or even provoked the attack is called the backdoor to war theory.
I think one of the reasons that perpetuates this myth is the fact that there's a couple of respectable historians that have argued for this position. They're vastly outnumbered by historians where the consensus is Roosevelt did not know that this attack was coming.
The backdoor to war theory takes certain facts and draws big conclusions from them. One fact was that Roosevelt was personally supportive of the United States joining the war, a fact that became a key issue during the 1940 presidential election campaign.
Roosevelt wanted America to be involved in the war. The American public was very reticent to get involved in this war after their experience of their involvement in the First World War.
Blocked by political and public opinion from sending troops to aid Britain and France in the fight against Nazi Germany, Roosevelt sought other ways of helping. From 1939, the president authorized sending weapons and equipment to Britain, France, and later the Soviet Union in the famous Lend-Lease program.
In late 1941, the United States was officially still neutral in the Second World War, although they were assisting the Allies, supplying war materials and supplies to the Allied nations. And they were already involved in some low-level fighting in the Battle of the Atlantic against the German U-boats.
Lend-Lease and the Destroyers for Bases deal helped the Allies immeasurably and was likened by Roosevelt to lending a garden hose to a neighbor to help put out a fire that could burn down your house as well as his. But the backdoor to war theory goes a big step further. This theory argues that what Roosevelt really wanted was something that would swing public opinion in favor of actually committing American troops to the fight. Perhaps this idea was stoked by the fact that FDR had frozen Japanese assets in the US in July 1941, and by August 1st, established an embargo on oil and gas exports to Japan, crippling their access to much-needed natural resources. Throughout 1941, the US had deciphered some of the coded messages that Japan sent its diplomats, but the US had not cracked the military code. This diplomatic intelligence gave the US some hints, but critically, not the when or where of a Japanese attack. Hawaii seemed an unlikely target.
The Americans suspected that there was going to be an attack by the Japanese. They didn't know where that might arrive. The consensus has been is they certainly didn't think that a fleet would sail 4,000 miles and try to destroy a whole navy almost in dock.
It was only at 11:25 a.m. in Washington, 2 hours before Pearl Harbor was bombed, that the US decoded and read diplomatic messages which implied an attack could happen that very day. And the rest is history. 18 ships were damaged or destroyed, more than 300 airplanes, and over 2,000 lives lost.
No one in America's political or military establishment had any idea that Pearl Harbor was a target for Japanese aggression in 1941. Even if America had broken all the Japanese codes and translated all of the intercepts, there was not one message that indicated Pearl Harbor would be attacked. That is the extent of the secrecy at which this mission was launched.
The US formally received Japan's declaration of war from the Japanese ambassador at around 3 p.m., 2 hours after the attack. The following day, Roosevelt sought Congress's agreement to declare war on Japan.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Within an hour, Congress agreed. Britain, as the US's ally, had also declared war on Japan. Yet the question of what Roosevelt knew and when did he know it arose almost immediately. In the following years, the US government made 10 inquiries into Pearl Harbor. What they found was that the US had badly underestimated Japan's capabilities and that the warnings of an attack were not taken sufficiently seriously. The base at Pearl Harbor was overly relaxed and didn't defend itself quickly enough when the attack came. The inquiries did not find hard evidence that Roosevelt knew or encouraged the attack. This is also the opinion of most historians. But what factors led to such an outrageous myth about the President of the US, and why does it perpetuate decades later? Just weeks earlier, the US had held a fiercely contested presidential election, during which Republican presidential candidate Wendell Willkie had openly accused Roosevelt of secret planning to enter the US into the war.
Willkie was saying, if you elect Roosevelt, your sons will be killed. So at the time, there was this sense that Roosevelt was going to push them towards war.
The idea comes in part because how could America not have known? America is the greatest power in the world. How could they have been surprised by an enemy that many saw as racially inferior?
This myth about Roosevelt and Pearl Harbor is an example of how divisive politics, distrust in government, and a disregard for evidence and fact can lead to damaging myths of history that linger for years after the events that spawned them. Roosevelt's reputation has been poorly served by this myth. But there is another figure of this period whose legend and legacy was cemented by various propaganda machines of World War II. Erwin Rommel was a German field marshal in the Wehrmacht or armed forces. A firm and capable general, his reputation as one of the greatest military commanders of World War II survives to this day. The so-called Rommel legend began in 1940, when Rommel directed the 7th Panzer Tank Division advance into France. He seemed the quintessential frontline commander, energetic, brave, a clever strategist, burning houses to provide smoky cover for his advance. He faked out the French defenders by pretending that flares were armor-piercing shells.
Rommel had performed very well in the Battle of France, leading his Panzer Division, the 7th. Had taken a lot of territory and made some very bold and daring manoeuvres, which really caught the attention, certainly of Hitler and Goebbels. So it was initially the German media and propaganda machine that shot him to fame. He became almost a household name in Germany.
It helped, too, that Rommel was media-friendly. He looked handsome and laughed easily. He was close to his men, chatting, telling jokes, and got into the thick of fighting, often being seen in or on tanks or other vehicles in the main column.
And he became almost overnight a very famous figure in Germany, the most highly touted generals. Rommel is best known for his exploits in leading the Africa Corps and later the Italian-German army in North Africa against the British and Commonwealth forces primarily.
For his cunning in this most difficult terrain, he earned the nickname the Desert Fox. It wasn't just the Germans who bought into the myth of Rommel's battlefield prowess. The British put their own shine on Rommel's reputation, a useful excuse for the Allies' struggle in Africa.
The Allies did help to cultivate the reputation of Rommel as a great general, and in part, to some degree, that was by way of explaining why their own generals were often failing against him, being beaten by him.
But the myth about Rommel was not confined to the battlefield. He was also portrayed as a type of honorable warrior, an enemy to the Allies, but one who could be respected. Rommel was peripherally connected to the officers and aristocrats who attempted to kill Hitler at his military headquarters, Wolfschanze, and was subsequently forced to commit suicide by the Germans. The Allies then depicted him as our friend Rommel, a good German, not really a committed Nazi. Yet, how much of this Rommel myth is actually true?
Well, there's no doubt that Rommel was a great operational commander. He was a bold, daring, offensive commander. He was excellent at maneuver warfare, but he was no better a strategist than any of the other senior German leaders. He was a poor logistician. He was not particularly inclined towards joint warfare. He rarely cooperated with the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, or the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine.
The early successes of the Axis troops in North Africa were as much due to ineffective Allied planning and preparation as they were to Rommel's leadership. The failed Allied campaign was hampered by insufficient troops and equipment, strained supply lines, and frequent changes of leadership. Rommel was not ever a member of the Nazi Party, but the idea that he did not support the Reich's ambitions is a fallacy.
Probably the most popular myth about Erwin Rommel is that he was an apolitical officer and that he was actively involved in the anti-Hitler resistance. Rommel was in fact a traditional German nationalist and militarist. He was anti-communist. He was a loyal German officer who believed that it was morally wrong for a German officer to try and kill his sovereign head of state that he had swore a personal oath of allegiance to.
Whilst the depiction of Rommel as an Allied sympathizer was unfounded, in 1944 he was implicated in the July 20 plot to assassinate Hitler. A renowned war hero at this point, he was given the choice of facing a messy public trial and disgrace, or a cyanide pill with his reputation and legacy intact. He chose the latter. Rommel seems to have been a competent commander, a cunning opponent, and an inspiring leader for his men. But romanticizing him as one of history's greatest military commanders and a less than committed Nazi keeps the propaganda myth alive. It also serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the power and manipulation of wartime propaganda and how difficult it can be to separate the truth from the myth once they have become intertwined. Many thousands of years ago, stories from ancient Greece tell us of another of history's greatest military myths, one that also warns us about the dangers of misunderstanding an enemy and their intentions. Deception and misdirection have been important elements of warfare since ancient times. Probably the most famous example of deceptive tactics is that of the fabled Trojan Horse, a myth that lives on to the present day. Paris of Troy had kidnapped the beautiful Helen after the goddess Aphrodite had promised him the most beautiful mortal woman in the world. To get Helen back, her husband Menelaus and his brother Agamemnon raised an army of Greek warriors. They lay siege to Troy over many years, with neither side getting the upper hand. The Greeks then came up with a sneaky plan. They build a horse of mountainous size and weave planks of fur over its ribs. They pretend it's a votive offering, and they secretly filled the insides with armed warriors.
They build this horse. It's massive. It's full of Greek soldiers. They leave it at the battlements of Troy, and they tell the Trojans that it is a gift to them from the Greeks, some sort of peace offering.
The myth of the Trojan War survives to us today in epic poems that were probably written in the late 8th century BC.
The story of the Trojan War, as Homer records it in the Iliad, the first time it is actually recorded in writing by a poet, we assume to be this person called Homer. That is where we get all of the beautiful myths and legends about the Trojan War. So he tells the stories of Paris and Helen. He tells the story about King Agamemnon. And these began as oral traditions, probably sometime in the late Bronze Age, where people began to sing these stories. And eventually these stories were put down by poets we generically call Homer in the Archaic Age, and they're committed to writing.
The Iliad describes events towards the end of a 10-year-long war between the ancient Greeks and the Trojans. The tale of the Trojan Horse comes to us from another of Homer's epic poems, the Odyssey, which tells us of the end of the Trojan War and introduces the Greek hero Odysseus.
So, wily Odysseus comes up with this idea, I know what let's do. We're gonna make a giant wooden horse because the Trojans revered horses. And we're gonna leave it like it's a gift and we're gonna go away. But in reality, the bulk of the army is just gonna hide out of sight, and a few of us are gonna go into the belly of the wooden beast and hide there quietly until they wheel us into the city. And then we'll come out after they've all gone to sleep and we'll put the city to the torch and let the rest of the Greek army in. And that is precisely what happens.
Most scholars think there may be a grain of historical truth to the story, a battle centuries before Homer's Iliad that is the historical source.
What is fascinating about the Trojan War is that we have lots of archaeological evidence that a war did take place between the Mycenaean Greeks and the Trojans. You can physically go to the site of the Trojan War at Troy now and stand in the remains. Whether there was a Helen and a real Menelaus, possibly not. They may be a mixture of historical figures that eventually got swept up in the romantic stories of the Trojan War.
While a war did take place, most scholars also agree that the famous Trojan Horse is most likely fable and myth.
I think the story of the wooden horse outside the walls of Troy seems to me a mythic sort of way of describing how the cleverness of a great general could breach the defenses of a mighty city.
One theory is that the wooden horse may refer to a siege tower, a tall structure which soldiers would climb up to launch arrows or spears over a city's walls. Or, another theory goes, the wooden horse was actually a ship. Homer uses the word seahorse to describe ships in the Odyssey. Archaeological finds show that the prows of ancient ships were sometimes carved into the shape of a horse's head. More than 3,000 years later, we'll probably never know the truth about the Trojan horse. But as with most good stories, perhaps that doesn't matter.
It captures our imagination because what it shows is the Greeks as inventors, the Greeks as really early pioneers in technology. If you go to the site of Troy today, you can see a reconstruction of the Trojan horse on the site.
And while the myth of the Trojan horse seems improbable, the Trojan War lives on to reinforce a cautionary tale.
I think the myth of the Trojan War, it's remembered through the Greek world for all sorts of reasons. And in this case, it's all about the fact that Paris chooses to have the most beautiful woman in the world. And so, like a lot of young men, makes bad choices based on fundamentally lust. And chaos ensues. So it's one of those cultural truths that doesn't have to have a basis in actual fact for people to understand what it's trying to tell you.
The universal themes of love, fate, honor, and glory have meant that the myth of the Trojan horse has continued, and so has the famous saying born of this myth, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," or more broadly, in war, don't trust your enemy. A sentiment that continues to ring true even thousands of years later. The myth of the Trojan horse describes how deception strategy was used to end a war. In more recent history, was a story that involved deception and myth-making used to justify starting a war. February 5th, 2003. U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the United Nations. The U.S., he said, had evidence that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, biological weapons, chemical weapons. Iraq's President Saddam Hussein had used these terrible weapons in the past, even against his own citizens. After Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990 and was defeated in the Gulf War, the UN required Iraq to get rid of its WMDs and allow inspectors to confirm they had been destroyed. But, Powell said, Iraq had lied and deceived the inspectors. Hussein still had WMDs. Iraq's neighbors and even the US were not safe. Hussein could use these weapons against them. Powell brought with him a tiny vial of white powder which, he said, if it had been anthrax, was enough to threaten the lives of several hundred people. And Hussein had, Powell alleged, much more than a tiny vial of anthrax.
It's amazing to think of Colin Powell turning up to the UN with his little vial. You know, this dramatic thing. It's almost like a pantomime. He turned up there with, I don't know, it's probably like talcum powder, but there was this dramatic presentation of evidence that nobody bought, of course, but it was one of the great theatrical moments in UN history.
This claim would lead the US and their allies to invade Iraq, overthrow Hussein's government, and start a war that would last for over 8 years. But the foundations for the war in Iraq goes back many years earlier to another war fought in the Gulf region. US President George Bush and UK Prime Minister Tony Blair regretted not removing Saddam Hussein after the first Gulf War and wanted to install a new, friendly government. They wanted a regime change, and with the Iraq War, they gave themselves another chance.
The threat from Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, potentially nuclear weapons capability, that threat is real.
The term was used to justify the intervention in Iraq as a way of describing what was believed or half believed, that the Iraqis had the capacity and the will to build nuclear and chemical and biological weapons. So it was invoked as a warning and supposed to strike terror in the world community that there was going to be some very nasty repercussions unless the country was invaded and this weapons program was halted.
Intelligence gathered by this and other governments leaves no doubt that the Iraqi regime continues to possess and conceal some of the most lethal weapons ever devised.
Words that fed right into the myth of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction.
Tonight, British servicemen and women are engaged from air, land and sea. Their mission? To remove Saddam Hussein from power and disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction.
The US, along with a coalition of the willing, launched a shock and awe bombing campaign against Iraq on the 20th of March 2003. This, said the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, was an illegal act.
What was made public and what was made even known to politicians at the time, American politicians, was a heavily redacted report from the intelligence community in which footnotes which related to skepticism about some of the claims being made were redacted. The reaction from the public to the claim by the Bush administration at the time, both to the American public, the world public and the UN, was general skepticism, and people did not buy it. In fact, there were huge protests all around the world to argue against the intervention in Iraq.
Once UK and US troops were on the ground, hundreds of intelligence analysts and military personnel scoured the country looking for the WMDs. They failed to find any, and very publicly, the myth began to fall apart.
It's very hard to know what was going on in the heads of particular members of the administration. But what had become operative, what made, I think, it persuasive to a number of people in the administration, of course, in other members of the international community, was this idea of a precautionary intervention.
Over 100,000 Iraqis died, and over 4,700 US and Allied troops were killed during the 8-year war. The concocted myth had had dire consequences.
There's a very strong argument to be made that ISIS, as we know them, would not exist without the interventions that foreign powers made into the area, the destabilisation of regimes, the re-emergence of various forms of ethnic conflict and bordering on civil war that has swept through the region since, can in many ways be attributed to that particular misadventure.
Saddam Hussein was captured by US troops in December 2003. The interim Iraqi government found him guilty of crimes against humanity, and he was hanged on the 30th of December 2006. The regime was changed, but at considerable cost to the US and UK's international credibility.
Whether it plays more generally into skepticism about governments is a much more complex question. Because of course, when the Americans turned up, they didn't find those weapons and they told everyone that they didn't find those weapons. So it's as strange, in some senses, if they were really to be distrusted, they may have just invented the fact that they'd found them.
Based on all the information we have to date, I believe we were right to take action.
The myth of the weapons of mass destruction had us question our trust in governments and revealed the ways in which those in authority could seek to justify a violent conflict to the public. But this was not always the case. In ancient Rome, violence did not need to be justified by those in power. It was an everyday reality. Ancient Rome conjures up images of storied emperors, the vast Roman army, and gladiators. Fighting was one of the most popular forms of entertainment in ancient Rome, with gladiators regaling spectators in the Circus Maximus, the Forum, and the Colosseum. Just how much of what we understand about these brutal events is fact, and how much is myth?
Gladiatorial combat actually goes back very early in Rome and might, in fact, have been a ritual borrowed from the Etruscans before the Romans. There seems to have been some sort of idea about the ritual spilling of blood in funeral rites, and up and through the time of Julius Caesar, certainly we see those sorts of rites. It becomes this kind of elaborate blood sport.
At the height of gladiatorial combats between the 1st century BC and the 2nd century CE, thousands of gladiators would be pitted against each other in a whole-day spectacular.
Although they started as exhibitions in honor of the dead as part of the funeral game ceremony, they become over time gradually part of the general display and spectacle and entertainment at Rome, up until the point where they're regularly part of religious festivals and magistrates will put them on.
We think of gladiators as oppressed slaves, thrown into the arena to provide bloody entertainment with their deaths. But is this long-held myth based on fact or fiction?
Certainly lots of gladiators were enslaved, but it was also possible to become a gladiator as a free person. If you volunteered as a gladiator, you signed up to it until you were released from your contract.
There were people who, for various reasons, chose to participate. Part of it's because the gladiators become sort of these rock star, big-time wrestler figures. I mean, they're immensely popular. It actually becomes an opportunity for fame, for fortune, for sex appeal. So you have sometimes people from the upper classes joining in.
Another popular myth is that gladiators always fought to the death. So why would anyone choose to become a gladiator if they were likely to be killed? Contrary to the popularly held myth, gladiators were trained to subdue their opponents, not kill them. Gladiators were matched with opponents whose complementary fighting style would make a good spectacle. The Rotarius, for example, fought with a trident and net to tangle his opponent, while the Secutor used a shield and a long knife. Gladiators were professionals with honed specialist skills, and fight organizers wanted to keep them alive to appear another day. Deaths did occur, but it was not a fight to the death in every match, and deaths often did not occur in front of the audience. It's estimated that a gladiator faced a 1 in 9 chance of death each fight.
I will say that there is a lot of graveyard evidence that gladiators who were mortally wounded, they were often dispatched with a single hammer blow to the head. And I think that probably took place back in the locker room, as it were, if they were not going to be able to be saved.
Even the mythical thumbs down gesture is more likely to have meant sheath your weapon than kill him. One of the reasons that myths surrounding gladiators persist centuries later is that we are still entertained by it. Gladiatorial combat is frequently portrayed in popular culture and often inaccurately. This was fighting as spectacle, orchestrated, prepared, choreographed. an engineered conflict for social and political purposes and to satisfy a bloodlust transposed from the battlefield. Nearly 2,000 years later, a myth was orchestrated and engineered, in this instance by a single violent act against an individual who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. World War I was a conflict like no other. It was the first truly global war and left an estimated 7 million civilians and 10 million armed forces dead. Centuries-old empires crumbled, and the map of the world was redrawn. One popular myth is that the complex global confrontation that was World War I began in Sarajevo by a lone gunman. On the morning of the 28th of June 1914, Gavrilo Princip was at Schiller's Delicatessen in Sarajevo. Princip was a student and a Bosnian Serb. He had just finished eating a sandwich when an automobile carrying a smartly dressed man and woman turned into the street right near the cafe. Princip pulled out a pistol and shot the couple, inflicting fatal wounds. They were the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife, the Archduchess Sophie. It was this single act of brutality, it's claimed, which prompted Austria and Germany to declare war on Serbia, only for Russia to come to Serbia's aid and bring Europe's great powers into conflict. Or so the story goes. The reality was that World War I started due to a complex set of circumstances in which the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was one piece of a larger puzzle. On that morning in 1914, Europe looked a lot different from today. Sarajevo was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was ruled by the Habsburg family.
The Habsburgs were one of the dominant royal families in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century. They had accumulated a patchwork of territories, partly through war, but largely through very carefully arranged marriages.
While the Habsburgs were attempting to secure strategic alliances around Europe, their own empire was floundering. Many ethnic groups within it started calling for their independence.
Particularly of concern to the Habsburgs was Serbia, which lay just across the border to the south of the Habsburg Empire. Serbia was a major client state of Russia.
Serbia had gained independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1878, but many Serbs lived in Bosnia, which was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and thus they were still not free from foreign rule. To force the Habsburgs into granting independence to Bosnia and unify Serbs, nationalists plotted to assassinate a member of the ruling family and shine a light on their dissatisfaction. And they settled upon Franz Ferdinand.
The Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the Habsburg throne. He was the nephew of Franz Joseph, the Emperor King of the Habsburg Empire, and he was the presumed heir.
Franz Ferdinand was to undertake a royal visit to Sarajevo to attempt to reinforce ties between Bosnia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And thus it was that on the 28th of June 1914, that Gavrilo Princip and the Archduke Franz Ferdinand would meet. Princip, an ardent nationalist, had been chosen by a Serbian secret society to be part of a six-man assassination team.
The assassins didn't really have a long-term strategy. In the short term, they hoped to attract attention to their cause by killing the Archduke, the heir to the Austrian throne. They also hoped to demonstrate to the outside world that there was a continued tradition of resistance to Austro-Hungarian rule.
But the assassins did have a plan on that day. They were to stake out the motorcade route, and when the Duke drove past, several assassins would have an opportunity to bomb the car carrying Franz Ferdinand. Unfortunately for the hit squad, the plan was a failure. Only one assassin even threw his bomb, missing Franz Ferdinand, but wounding a police officer in the crowd. Surprisingly, Despite this attempt on their lives, the Archduke and Duchess decided to continue their visit to Sarajevo's town hall. And the failed assassins scattered, with Gavrilo Princip looking for a spot of lunch. Subsequently, the Archduke cut short his reception at the town hall and decided to visit the policeman who had been injured in the bomb attack on his car earlier that day. During the journey, his car took a wrong turn and stalled outside Schiller's cafe, where Princip was now eating his sandwich, a pistol handily tucked in his belt. The sandwich story is a memorable detail, but it's likely a fiction. The first mention of a sandwich-eating assassin originated in a 2001 novel, 12 Fingers by Joe Soers. From there, it spread and has now moved into the myth of that fateful day. Not only is the sandwich detail a myth, but so is the idea that the origins of World War I are the result of a single person's actions outside a deli in Sarajevo. There were far more complex factors at work.
After the assassination, it was not immediately clear to participants what the broader significance was. They certainly didn't realize immediately that a cataclysmic global conflict was about to ensue.
After Franz Ferdinand's assassination, the Habsburgs, and thus Austria-Hungary, issued demands to Serbia called the July Ultimatum. Relations between the two soured, and Serbia mobilized for war.
The way in which this developed from a localized war into a world war was not due to the Habsburgs themselves. It was only possible because Europe was divided into a series of grand alliances.
The European alliances were complex and interconnected, so when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Russia mobilized in support of its ally, Serbia. But on the other side, Germany was allied with Austria-Hungary. So when Russia came to the table, the Germans too mobilized for war. Add into the mix the historical conflicts between many European powers, the global competition for colonies, and the Anglo-German naval arms race, and one sees how this assassination pulled a small thread of this complicated web, and the world tumbled towards war.
The timing of the assassination was critical in a few respects, because the international order was changing at that time. It came at the most dangerous time in European politics.
By November, two opposing alliances had solidified. The Ottomans, Germany, and Austria-Hungary formed the Central Powers. They were opposed by the Allied or Entente powers, France, Britain, and Russia, later joined by Italy and Japan. Soon the conflict stretched across the globe. The triggers for World War I were far more complex than the embroidered tale of a hungry man serendipitously stumbling across his assassination target. But sometimes, myths endure because they're a convenient and memorable shorthand for the more complicated details of history. In fact, the First World War in general proved fertile ground for myth-making. Take our picture of trench warfare, soldiers spending months knee-deep in mud and being shelled or sniped at before making a deadly rush across no man's land. Some of that picture is correct, but the idea that troops spent long periods of time in the trenches is another oversimplification. A soldier might spend 5 days in a frontline trench, then 15 or so days in a rear or support trench. The rest of the month, about half the time, would be spent in the reserve, well back from the front, training and resting up. If a soldier had served for long enough, they might even get to go home on leave. Long stints at the front were in fact a rarity.
Generally, what would happen would be troops would rotate in and out of the front line trenches and then the rear trenches and then well back. What they found out early on in trench warfare was that the mental and physical strain and the losses sustained by units if they were left in the trenches too long was too much to bear. Units would typically spend a little bit less than 50% of their time in the trenches. Other units a little bit more than 50%, just depending on where they were.
This is not to say that time at the front was easy. The opposite is true. It was short because it was difficult.
Trench warfare during the First World War was not a pretty picture. It was a pretty awful place to be a lot of the time. I guess picture a subterranean world where men are living in trenches roughly 8 feet deep. Men are huddled in there trying to stay out of the way of the bombs and the bullets. During wet season, it could be absolutely appalling. The places would just turn to a morass and the trenches would be just full of mud.
About 10% of soldiers were killed and another 15% wounded, although it is hard to be precise. The violence and sheer length of the war was a surprise to the empires who had started it. Both sides had thought the war would be quick and decisive. Their miscalculation is one of history's greatest tragedies.
The Germans were unable to win the war in the projected 6 weeks. The British, the French, the Belgians combined to block their moves, and when that stalemate set in, both sides couldn't advance without taking really heavy casualties, so both sides dug in.
The result was 4 years of brutal conflict. The war only came to a close when the Allied powers, assisted by the US entering the war in 1917, gradually gained the upper hand. Realizing they had lost, the Central Powers agreed to an armistice. On June the 28th, 1919, exactly 5 years after Archduke Ferdinand's assassination, Germany and the Allied powers signed the Treaty of Versailles. The other Central Powers signed separate treaties. The peace settlements broke up the last of the great European empires. History's great wars and conflicts have changed the world. They've redrawn the map, invented new technologies and ever more devastating ways of killing one another. Sometimes individual figures become larger than life, heroes or villains on the world stage, and stories of epic battles become legends told and retold throughout the ages.
All of these stories, they continue to be powerful because they tell us important things, not just about the world around us, but about ourselves, about who we want to be, about who we know in our heart of hearts we really are, about that which we want and that which we fear. All of these stories help us to understand our place in the world.
While the oversimplification of world events can make things easier to comprehend, it remains one of the great tragedies of humanity that we don't appear to be able to resolve our differences without resorting to conflict, reminding us that the myths and legends of war echo throughout millennia.